In this series, we're going to take your piece from this to this. All using skills, tips and tricks brought to you right here. There's no previous learning needed, no fancy plugins or synthesizers, and no musical understanding. The only things you'll need will be your eyes, your ears, a DAW, and a sample instrument. So come on, let's get started. Hi, Adam from Audio Imperia here, and welcome to episode 7 of the journey to becoming a composer. As always, if you're enjoying this series, please don't forget to give us a like and leave us a comment, and also subscribe to our channel to make sure you're the first to hear about new content. In the first 4 episodes of this series, we've covered the core concepts of MIDI composition, looking at DAWs, MIDI data, and sample playback engines, and how we can utilize key switching, expression, dynamics, velocity, and legato to enhance the realism and musicality of our compositions. In episode 5, we changed gears a little and analysed our musical example, looking at how I composed the piece and some of the compositional techniques that I used. Like episode 6, we're going to be taking a closer look at the MIDI composition in action, but in this episode we're going to be focusing on the woodwinds and the percussion, and seeing how we use the concepts we discussed in episodes 1 to 4 in those sections. Let's head over to the DAW and take a closer look. Hey, welcome back to the DAW. So maybe before we dive in, let's just listen to the whole piece as one so we can remember what we're working with here. So in the previous episode, we had a look at the strings and the brass. And in this episode, we're going to have a look at the woodwinds and the percussion, both the atonal percussion and the tonal percussion. We'll also briefly look at the choirs as well, but there's not too much going on there. So probably the first thing to do is take a look at the woodwinds and talk a little bit about how we're using the woodwinds in this piece. So the woodwinds are not a feature in this piece. What they're really doing is providing several important functions. They're first of all providing some warmth to the arrangement. What you'll often find is when you have brass and strings playing at the top levels of their dynamics, they'll sound beautiful and they'll sound sort of very fizzy and alive and very bright and powerful, but sometimes they'll miss some warmth in the mid frequencies. Woodwinds have a beautiful quality in that kind of mid-frequency spectrum, from the low mids all the way up to the sort of high mids. They really cut through there and they blend beautifully with the brass and the strings to provide some warmth and some body that's maybe missing when those ensembles are playing at their top register. So I'm using these woodwinds fairly traditionally in kind of full orchestral writing here, just to add some warmth and some glue. And I'm also doing one thing with them as well, which is adding some excitement. So we'll just go through the woodwinds from beginning to end, and then we'll talk a little bit about how we're using them in each section. So as you can hear, the woodwinds are really just providing some body and some accompaniment. They're not really doing anything major by themselves. In the intro section, they're doing hardly anything. They're really just supported in the low strings. There's the 2 bassoons that are literally just playing this kind of pedal note that accompany the cello and the double basses in the strings. So it's very, very subtle. They're very quiet. They're really not featuring. They're just adding some warmth and some body to that low end. Then the next thing that we're going to hear is the flutes and the oboes in the higher register. And again, this is all just supporting. They're really just playing the melody line that the brass and the strings are playing at that point too. Really straightforward stuff. And what's happening is the clarinets are also playing this short ascending feature that you can hear, and they're just accompanying the violas that are doing the same. And if I just play this in conjunction with the strings, you'll hear a little bit more about how they're working with the strings. They're literally just following along. But if I take the Woodwinds out, you'll hear some of the warmth goes. So if I just play the strings on their own. Fine, but with the Woodwinds, they just sound a lot more wholesome. And the Woodwinds are also providing some clarity and some definition to those lines. So the Woodwinds in the intro are supporting. They're really doing nothing other than supporting the other instruments. So let's talk about how we're using them in the middle section, which is slightly different. Let's just hear them in isolation. So what we have the Woodwinds doing here is playing the chords. As we said in the previous episode, we have the brass and the strings really just holding these big chords at this point while we have the melody playing. But whereas we just have them playing in sustain in the brass and the strings, in the Woodwinds we have them playing trilled. What the trill is doing is adding a lot of texture and movement and excitement. By definition, trills just sound quite exciting. They add a lot more life and intensity than a standard sustain. So if I just play, for example, the strings and the Woodwinds again together, you'll hear what the Woodwinds are doing. It's a really subtle texture, but it's really adding a lot to these sort of inner parts and creating a lot of excitement. So let's move on to the final section and I'll show you what this sounds like. So let's just have a little look at the programming side of things, and it's all pretty much stuff that we've covered before. As you can see, I'm using the expression to some extent and certainly the dynamics to just ride everything and give everything a sense of shape. So if I just take one instrument group, for example, these oboes here, you can just see I'm using quite gentle but pronounced dynamic changes here. And the function of this is really just to bring shape to the chords and shape to the flow of the music at each point, so you can hear with each chord I'm sort of starting quiet, I'm ramping up in the middle of that chord to a higher dynamic, and then I'm bringing it back down, and that just gives it a sense of flow. I think that just about wraps up everything that we've got to say with Woodwind. It's all pretty subtle stuff. It's providing a very important function, but I would describe the function in this piece mostly as gluing everything together. It's providing a kind of middle ground between the extreme dynamics of the brass and the strings and the percussion. And it's just bringing all that together and adding some warmth and generally filling out the frequency spectrum. So let's move on to percussion now. Now, percussion can be used a whole variety of different ways. In modern music, like trailer music, for example, percussion can play a huge role and can be the driving factor in the music. In more traditional symphonic music like this, the percussion tends to just play a supporting role, and what I would describe as it's almost like punctuation marks in sentences. The percussion usually doesn't draw too much attention to itself, but when you want to make a dynamic impact or when you want to have certain points emphasized, the percussion is brilliant at doing that. So let's talk a little bit about how the percussion is being used, and we'll start with the atonal percussion. And what we mean by atonal percussion is basically percussion that doesn't have any discernible pitch. For example, bass drum hits, timpani hits, snare drum hits, things that have no discernible pitch, but that still provide an important function in the music. I should just add for clarity that timpani is technically tonal percussion, but I've just put it in with the atonal percussion because I'm using it much more alongside the bass drum and the cymbals and the snare drum in this piece than as a feature of itself. So if I just show you how we're using the percussion, let's start with the intro and look at how we're using it there. It's pretty subtle, but it's doing a few important things here. The first thing that we're doing is using the timpani and the snare drum, and we're playing rolls on both that are very, very, very slowly ramping up in intensity. And you can see how I'm using the dynamics and expression here just to gradually increase both the volume and the tonal intensity. If we listen to what we're doing in the tam-tam, which is a kind of gong, basically a big gong, it's pretty subtle. Right on that first beat at the beginning of this piece, it's just adding a kind of dramatic hit, just adds a bit of white noise that helps to start the piece off and give it a kind of interesting intro without being too overbearing. So you hear when we combine that with the snares and the timpani, we get Again, it's just like a little mark at the beginning of the piece just to introduce things. And if you look at what we're doing with the cymbals in the beginning, we're using a bowed cymbal, which is a kind of cymbal effect to just create this really interesting texture. As you can hear, it's somewhere between a kind of cymbal roll and a cymbal scrape, and it's just helping to provide some interest in this intro section. As we said, we're looking to make this intro section kind of enigmatic and mysterious, but building in intensity, and this quite ethereal cymbal effect is just helping to do that. Let's have a look at how we use the percussion in the middle section. So we'll go from the end of the intro here. So a couple of things to say. First of all, just as we head into that second section, we have the grand cassa, which is like a big bass drum, just providing a roll, and that's really acting as a big punctuation mark to announce the beginning of this big middle section. So if I just play that on its own. And that's supporting the cymbals, the snares, and the timpani. So all together, it's a really big announcement. What's happening then is we're using the triangle as a kind of sustaining instrument just to add some high-end frequency content in the middle section. It's really contrasting and adding to the woodwind trill. So if I just play them together. If you think about what we're doing here, we're having, as we said in the previous episode, big chords on the brass, the choir, and the strings. But we don't want everything to be too static, and this is really where our movement is coming from, a combination of the woodwind trills that we mentioned and this triangle. That's being punctuated by these bigger hits on the kick drum here from the Nucleus drum kit. Simple, but just helping to add punctuation marks to each change of chord. And that's also happening in the timpanis and the snares as well. And as you can hear, we're just having slight rolls on the snares and the timpanis to lead into each chord change. Finally, we have a similar thing going on in the cymbals, just to provide some high-end content. And that's pretty much everything that's going on in the percussion here. We're really just using it as a punctuation feature, just to mark each chord change, just to add some hits where we need them to bring increased emphasis. So let's just move to the outro and hear what we're doing there, and it's very much a similar thing. Pretty much rolls across the board, and those rolls are increasing in intensity as we move to the big climactic outro. So if I just play that in combination with everything else. Just a big flourish at the end to finish us off. And as you can see, I'm making fairly judicious use of the dynamics and expression for most of these, just to really make sure that we're adding dynamic contrast. So let's have a little look at the tonal percussion here. We only have two tonal percussion going on here. That's the glockenspiel and the harp. Let's start and just have a listen in isolation. So not much to report here. Really, these are more decorative or just being used to emphasize certain melodies or certain features at certain points. So let's talk about the glockenspiel first. That's nice and easy. We're really just using it to emphasize things that are going on in the woodwind, strings, and brass. So it's just helping to bring out that little melody that we have going on. Let's just play it with the woodwinds and the strings. Using the glockenspiel this way is quite a common technique you'll find in a lot of sort of traditional Hollywood scoring. What it does is it adds some transient, because you hit the glockenspiel, it has quite a hard attack, and that just helps to really bring a melody out in the mix, or bring a melody out in the arrangement. Now let's have a look at the harp. In the intro stages, it's really just being used to pick out a few notes to add some accompaniment. And incidentally, I played this in, and I played it in pretty awfully, but it doesn't matter because you can barely hear it. If I just play the strings, the woodwinds, and the harp together. so you can barely hear it. It's just adding these little flourishes, these little chord features. It's just decoration. It keeps things moving. It keeps things interesting. Probably the first real major function of the harp is going to be in the movement into this middle section. We have a harp glissando here, which is a very rapid sort of run through a bunch of different notes, which just adds a lot of excitement and is a great way to transition from one section to another. So if I play you in isolation, it sounds like this. Even better when it's played with the rest of the piece, it sounds like this. You can hear it's really just helping to announce the next section, and that's pretty much how I'm using the harp for the rest of this piece. I use it again a bit further on here just to emphasize this section here. I use it in a slightly different fashion here. Whereas we've been having glissandos that go up, I now have a glissando that goes down. On its own sounds a bit weird, again, not very well played in, but with the rest of the instruments, it sounds like this. What that does is where we have that pause here, the downward glissando helps to add to the excitement. It's the first and only time we have a downward glissando in this piece, and it just slightly different. Whereas most of the time we expect it to go up and flourish upwards into something, the downward gives us pause for thought for a second, which just helps sell this little pause here into the final section. And then in the final section we have a downward and upward glissando. So if I play that in isolation, just a very Hollywood technique, so in conjunction with everything else sounds like this. We move on just maybe very quickly to the choir now. There's not much to say here that we haven't covered in the other instruments, but if I just play a little bit of the choir. So the choir is really a support instrument here, but just the excitement that voices singing in a high dynamic will bring to a piece can't be understated. Really just supporting the other instruments and providing these big chords, probably more than most instruments really riding the dynamics here. I'll just show you what that sounds like. One thing that I would say with human voice is that you really need to make good use of the dynamics if you want to make them sound like they're real. So combined with the rest of the orchestra, they just help to add a lot of excitement, a lot of warmth, a lot of humanity. You'll hear without the choir, there's just a lot of life goes out of the piece. Really important to the overall life and tonal quality of this piece. Finally, I'm just using one of the pads from Nucleus called the Aftermath pad, as you can see here. What this is doing is just providing essentially some more exciting frequency content. So if I just play this in isolation, really simple stuff. By itself, it doesn't seem to be doing that much, but if I just play it in context and then mute it in and out. Subtle but important. It's just filling out that frequency spectrum. So I think that probably takes us to the end of everything that we want to look at here. These instrument groups are playing a much smaller role in the piece in comparison to the brass and the strings, but that smaller role is by no means less important. Sometimes in arranging, and particularly in arranging in full orchestral symphonic music, a lot of what you're doing is layering things up in an intelligent and pleasing way. Even though these instrument groups are not featuring in this piece, the role they're providing is incredibly important, and it's providing some punctuation, some warmth, and some consistency that would otherwise not be there. So there you have it. In the last few episodes, we've looked at how we composed our musical example and how we used the concepts we discussed in episodes 1 to 4 to create maximum realism and expression across each section of our orchestra. In the final episode of our series, The Journey to Becoming a Composer, we're going to touch on mixing and mastering, briefly discuss some further concepts in MIDI composition, and talk a little bit about the future of the series. As always, if you're enjoying this content, please feel free to like this video and leave us comments below, and also subscribe to our YouTube channel so you're the first to hear about new content in the future. Thanks so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in the next episode.